Hello and welcome. My name is Eddie Jennings from EJSLLC.com, and this is the first of the videos on the advanced interval studies. And in this video, we're going to talk about chromatic intervals. And so we'll expand beyond the major and perfect intervals that we learned about in the previous series and start exploring augmented, diminished, and minor intervals as well. So without further ado, let's jump in. So chromatic intervals. Let me jot this on the paper here, or what looks like paper. This refers to intervals that are outside of what's considered diatonic, and you probably realize this as far as the term chromatic refers to color, and we get colors by altering various notes with sharps, flats, or naturals, as the case may be. And so the intervals that we've talked about thus far in the basic series were perfect and major. And we're going to use these intervals to, for lack of a better phrase, calculate the following kind of intervals. We have minor, diminished, diminished, and augmented. So, the perfect and major intervals, if you remember your major scale, let's go back to our good old C major scale, and the diatonic intervals in that we had, I'm going to jot this on the right hand side here, we started with a major second, or rather you have the unison, so if you were to play a C major scale, two C's here. Alright, that would be a perfect prime or perfect unison. We can call that P for perfect prime. We had a major second, C to D, a major third, C to E, a perfect fourth, C to F, perfect fifth, C to G, major sixth, C to A, major seventh, C to B, and then perfect octave, C to C. So, what I encourage you in your interval study is get used to how those intervals sound. And as far as this is what the octave sounds like, this is what a major second sounds like, this is what a major third sounds like. And in the second part of this video, when I go to the keyboard, I'll play these for you so you have that oral reference. Something to also think about is when you're trying to calculate this on other notes, such as you pick, let's say, an F sharp, and you need to figure out what a major third is. Well, there are a couple ways of doing it. One way is being able to spell an F sharp major scale and knowing that the diatonic interval of major third was going to be A sharp in that example. Another way is counting the half steps. I'm going to show you kind of the way I think about it. There's no one perfect way to approach intervals, but this is what I've found effective for me, and it's what I've used to teach my students, and so hopefully it'll be able to help you as well. So we're going to start with our perfect intervals. And when we alter a perfect interval, so our P for perfect, the interval, of course, is the distance between two notes. And for a perfect interval, if you were to reduce the size of that interval by a half step, so I'm going to put minus a half step, that interval is going to become what's called diminished. If we were to take that perfect interval and raise it by a half step, it's going to become augmented. And I'll show you some examples here, and again later in the video I'll play you the examples so you can hear how they sound. So let's take the C, for example, the unison. So we have two C's, or if we were writing this to where the C's would be sounding at the same time, so two C's. Now, this is that perfect unison or perfect prime. The thing to remember about intervals is the first word when we're naming an interval refers to quality. The second word is the distance. And the distance is talking about distance between letters. So in this case, both of these letters are C. We call, even though it's the same note, we call it the distance of 1. All right. So keeping the letter names the same, which is key when we're learning about naming intervals and labeling intervals, letter names are important for this. So keeping the C's the same, it's possible to augment this interval. And I'll show you. Let me erase a couple of things that we have here. And this I'm simply going to move to another spot because I want to keep it around. That'll be important for us. So if I were to take our C's, draw another measure here, and have the second note be C sharp, well, what have we done here? The C stays the same, so it's still considered prime or unison. But if you were to play C and C sharp together, or melodically as I have written here, it's clearly different pitches. That interval has widened in some way. And think about it. C sharp raises a note a half step. That's now a half step different. And as we said, a perfect interval, when you widen that interval by a half step or make it larger by a half step, we call it augmented. So this would be augmented prime. We usually use a capital A to refer to an augmented interval. You can also achieve this by lowering the second note of the interval when you're dealing with a prime or a unison. So if we had C to C flat, now this is going lower in pitch, but remember, we don't really care about highness, or rather direction of pitch. We care about the distance between the two pitches. So this is also augmenting by a half step. And then you can also choose the first note and alter it. So if you had C sharp to C, I have to use the natural sign here to make that be a C again. Or if you had C flat to C, again using the natural sign to cancel that flat. I'm trying to use the natural sign. Those are all going to be augmented primes. Now, is it possible to diminish this unison or prime interval? The answer is no, because the original interval, that perfect unison, is already the same pitch. We can't get any closer to a pitch than the same pitch. So for the perfect unison, it's not feasible to diminish that. So you don't have the diminished option available to you with this particular interval. Let's take another perfect interval. Let me erase what we have here. Let's take the perfect fourth. So C to F, perfect fourth. So can we widen this interval? Yes, we can. We can either, and this is true for any interval, you can either raise the second note, which is what we're going to do here, C to F sharp. So this is a perfect fourth. This has now become an augmented fourth. You can also widen this interval by lowering the first note. So you would have C flat to F. That's also going to be an augmented fourth. Now, can we shrink the interval? Can we make it smaller? The answer to that is yes as well. So here's our original perfect fourth, C to F. We can lower the upper note, so C to F flat. That would result in a diminished fourth. Notice I'm using the lowercase d for that diminished. We can also shorten that interval. Rather than lowering the upper note, we can lowering the second note, we can raise the first note. This is also a diminished fourth. Now I'm writing these melodically just to where you can see it. This also applies to harmonic intervals. And sometimes it's easier to hear the change in in width of an interval when you're playing them as harmonic intervals, such as, and again, I'll demonstrate this on the piano, but you play that perfect fourth, and you play the perfect fourth again, but we raise the upper note, becomes augmented, or we play that perfect fourth and we lower the upper note, it becomes diminished. Sometimes a little bit easier to hear the differences in these intervals, and really that's the key is, can you hear the difference in the intervals? Now, theory is all about little patterns and such, and you're looking at this and you're like, hey, can we alter this interval even further? Well, technically you can. I mean, if you wanted to, you have the C sharp there for the diminished fourth. You could do something like this: C sharp and F flat. And so what would we call that? Possibly a doubly diminished fourth, because we've made it even smaller. The problem is, you're not going to see that much in music, and it doesn't really have any kind of functional use. Because if you were to respell this, just respell the F flat as an E, then at this point you're at a minor third above C sharp. We'll get into the minor intervals in a couple of minutes. So while this is possible, and also on the augmented side, you could theoretically do C flat and F sharp. And I guess you'd have a doubly augmented fourth. Those are not intervals that are functional. I mean, can they exist? Sure, but it's not. You're getting to where you're basically creating inharmonic intervals to other more common intervals, and it gets to that cat CAT versus cat KAT kind of thing. CAT is the correct way, and what we're going to make more common. So the octave, you can do the same thing. You can augment it, you can diminish it. That's by raising this by a half step. Now, I'll show you a quick example of doing this to the octave. So you have your and this time I'm going to write it as a harmonic interval. So two notes on top of each other. So we have our perfect octave. We can augment this by, I'm just going to do measures at a time, by raising the upper note a half step. You can also augment it by lowering the lower note by a half step. So perfect octave, augmented octave, augmented octave. And then we can diminish it by lowering just the upper note. And we can also diminish it by raising just the lower note. There's your diminished version of the octave. And again, when you hear these, each of these qualities will be different. The interval, as far as note to note, is still the same. It's still 8 letter names: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And of course, count that first letter as 1. That doesn't change, but what we're changing when we're getting into diminished and augmented intervals, we're changing the quality of this once perfect interval. We've either augmented it or diminished it. Augmented, of course, meaning we have widened the interval. Doesn't matter if we're widening it by changing the lower note or upper note. We're simply making the interval wider, and diminishing, we're compressing the interval. So I'm going to move this over. Actually, I'm going to move this over first. If you're curious, the application I'm using is something called Penultimate. A friend in the Dungeons and Dragons group recommended it to me, and it is awesome. It's free, syncs with Evernote, really good stuff. So there's your plug for Penultimate. Now, major intervals, you have a little bit more flexibility. So our major intervals, and this is our major second, third, fourth. Major second, third, sixth, and seventh. So with a major interval, capital M, if we were to increase a major interval by a half step, so plus a half step, we're going to get an augmented interval. Just like with the perfect interval. You took the perfect interval and you added a half step, you now have an augmented interval. For a major interval, if we were to shorten the interval or compress the interval by a half step, we now have a minor interval. Pretty simple. So why not diminish? We actually can go a step further with that. But for right now, consider major intervals. We can widen the interval by a half step, it becomes augmented. We can shorten that interval by a half step and it becomes minor. So I'm going to move this over here and we'll do some examples. One thing in my critique of penultimate, sometimes it leaves little artifacts behind. So let's take the major third in C major. So C, E. So that's a major third. Just like with the perfect interval, if we raise the second note or the higher note by a half step, C to E sharp, that becomes an augmented third. Also, we can lower the first note by a half step, so that becomes C flat. You have E. That would also be an augmented third. This is still a third because as far as the actual letters, C, D, E, that's still the distance of 3 letters. But again, we're changing the quality of it to augmented by widening that interval. We're making the interval longer by either raising the first note or lowering the, by raising the second note or the higher note and lowering the first note. Now, so far, all I've done is gone in the direction of ascending intervals. There's a method behind that. I've found that if you learn these concepts just focusing on one direction, it is easier to apply that concept when we start to move notes descending. So rather than trying to mix it up. You may be able to handle it all, great if you can, but I've found in my experience it's a little bit easier. Let's do all the concepts in one direction, and then once we've learned the concept, apply it to different things. So turning a major third into a minor third, so let's go back, C, E for our major third. Just like with a diminished perfect interval, we can lower the top note by a half step. This turns into a minor third. Or we can raise the lower note by a half step and turn this into a minor third. You might be wondering why I'm doing this strange little M symbol. It doesn't quite look like a cursive M, and the reason, this goes back to my undergrad theory days with good old Dr. Jolene Davis when I was at the University of Georgia. She had us do our minor intervals with this like lowercase m with an extra hump, and the reason why she did it was because it made life easier for her when she was like grading theory papers and such. And it was clear that this is not a capital M indicating major, and so just as a tradition, I've kept that. You could certainly do this, and that would be a minor third. Now, this same idea can be applied to the major second, major sixth, and major seventh as well. So let me show you some quick examples of that. And again, all we're doing is taking this diatonic interval and we are widening it or shrinking it by a half step to create our chromatic intervals. So if we were to do C to D, it's our major second. A minor second, I'm going to diminish the intervals in the upper staff this time, C to D flat. Now, if you recall some of our real basic intervals, we talked about whole steps and half steps. The major and minor second are the chromatic interval names of whole steps and half steps. The major second being the whole step, the minor second being a half step. We can also do C sharp. We can raise that lower note to D to create the minor second. And I'll do this on the lower staff this time. We can also augment a second. So C to D sharp, be an augmented second. And you could also do C flat to D to create the augmented second. Now, one thing I do want to mention about especially the augmented third that we just did, and eventually we'll get to the augmented seventh, those are intervals that you don't typically see. It's another case of, can they exist? Yes, but typically they're usually going to be spelled in whatever their enharmonic interval will be, and that's how they'll function in harmony. But for this exercise, I'm kind of showing you how it could theoretically exist when you're taking these perfect major intervals and changing the interval distance by the half steps. Augmented seconds, you'll see those a little bit more commonly. It's something that that I know when you're learning your four-part choral style of harmony study, you typically avoid augmented seconds. They tend to be pretty difficult to hear and sing. But again, this exercise is showing you how to create that if you want. And then, of course, could you get a diminished second? You could possibly do like a D double flat. And so you now have a unison sound, C and D double flat. But again, that gets to the realm of, could you theoretically have it? Yes. Does it have any real function? No. So that's why we're just sticking to the half-step alterations. Next, we'll do the sixth. You might ask, why did you start with the major third? Again, when I get to the keyboard, it'll make a little more sense. You're pretty used to hearing major and minor chords, and that major and minor third are what make those triads and chords how they sound. I mean, yeah, the fifth is important as well, but that major and minor third really define that sound of the major and minor triad. And so I use that first just because it's a little bit easier to hear. So going to the sixth, C to A, it's a major sixth. Just like we've done with all of these others, we can lower the upper note, which is going to make this a half step shorter of an interval. And we have a minor sixth. I'm going to put a little star here. The minor sixth is my all-time favorite sounding interval. I cannot tell you why, it just is. And does that mean it's better than all the other intervals? No, it doesn't. It's just my own personal opinion. But I can remember being in undergrad music theory, and we're learning about our intervals, and Dr. Davis played that minor six, and just there was something about the timbre of that interval that just it resonated with me. Anyway, so just like all of the others, if we wanted to shrink this major six interval, we can also raise the lower note to C sharp. So you would have C sharp A. That's also a minor sixth. Can we augment the interval? And the answer is yes. I've swapped out doing my diminishing on the top and augmenting on the bottom. So here's our... Now notice how I said diminishing an interval, yet we're calling it a minor interval. The action to diminish is to make shorter. The action to augment is to make shorter. When you do that action of diminishing a major interval, it becomes a minor interval. So if I were to take our major sixth and then raise the upper note, so I'm augmenting the interval and making it wider, we have an augmented sixth. We can also, again, lower the first note and still create an augmented sixth. Now this augmented sixth, I'm going to circle this rather than star it, you're going to find the augmented sixth to be a pretty important interval when you do your study of harmony and you start getting into what are called the Augmented Six Chords, the French, Italian, and German six. This is a whole set of triads based on how you resolve the augmented six. So in your study of intervals and you're trying to learn how to spell them quickly, get to know your augmented six. It'll be your friend. So the seventh can get the same treatment. Now, as I mentioned before, when we augment the seventh, that's one of these, yes, it exists as far as the theory of it, but it's not something you're going to see very often in practice. So here's our seventh, C to B. Now I'll go back to augmenting on the upper staff this time. To augment it, same pattern. We raise the upper note by a half step. We can also lower the lower note by a half step. Again, augmented seventh are not intervals that you're going to see very often. However, when we diminish this seventh and turn them into minor intervals, that you're going to see much more often. So here's our C to B, major seventh, C to B flat, minor seventh. This minor seventh, you just like that augmented six. When you start learning about the augmented six chords, you're going to know and love your augmented six. I'd say you're going to know and love the minor seventh even more. You see the minor seventh so much when you're dealing with dominant chords, and when you start getting into modulations and you start getting into secondary dominance. This minor seventh interval, which can be created diatonically when you're spelling triads on the dominant. That's beyond the scope of what we're doing. But this minor seventh, and even if you were to play one, and again I'll play them for you in the second half of the video, you can hear there is definitely some kind of dissonance or tension in that minor seventh that has to be dealt with. And so of course composers are going to exploit that tension to get you interested in their music. And just as with the other intervals, we can create the minor seventh by raising the lower note a half step and keeping the upper note the same. That would also be a minor seventh. So for major and perfect intervals, when we diminish that, or rather when we lower the interval or shorten the interval by a half step, for perfect intervals they become diminished. For major intervals they become minor. And then for widening the intervals from a perfect interval, if we add a half step to it, it becomes augmented. And then for a major interval, if we were to add a half step, we also call that augmented. So now I'm going to give you some examples of how these perfect and major intervals sound when we alter them. So I'm going to start with the perfect fifth. So as you can see, we have our middle C here, a G here. So if we play these melodically, it's the sound of a perfect fifth. If we play them harmonically, we have that sound for the perfect fifth. Now, when we augmented it, one of the options we had was raising the upper note by a half step. So we'd change it to G sharp. There's your augmented fifth. It was, but when we augment it, it almost has like a more open sound in a way. Now, we could go the other way. We could take that upper note and lower it a half step, and then that diminishes the fifth. So here's the perfect fifth again. And now we're going to diminish it. And that we call a tritone, or diminished fifth. And tritone refers to the fact that there's three whole steps between the lower note and the upper note, the tritone. So another example I want to show you was about that perfect unison. So if I were to just play the middle C, that's it, just middle C. If I were to play a note on top of it that's the same as middle C, I'm going to imagine two fingers pressing the same key. We get the unison sound. We can augment it, raise it a half step. Not a very pleasant sound, but it has widened that interval. You hear more distance in it than just the unison pitch. And as I explained in the video, then it's not going to be possible to diminish that unison any further because the unison, you're already there. I also want to give you an example of major and minor. So if we take the major third above C, which is E, and we listen to that quality of the major third, and then to turn it to a minor third, one of the examples was we take that lower note, the upper note, and lower it a half step. And there is a minor third. Sounds different than the diminished fifth, minor third, but it's very different than major third. Now, one of the other examples we did was we took the interval. I'm going to again go back to the perfect fifth. And what we did was we took the lower pitch and then we altered it to be able to widen or shorten the interval. So if I take that perfect fifth and I lower the first note, the lower note by a half step, becomes, there's an augmented fifth. This would be C flat to G. I could also take the lower note and raise it a half step. That creates that diminished fifth sound. And again, I raise the C to C sharp, creating the diminished fifth, C sharp to G. You can do the same thing with the major intervals as well. I'm going to go back to the major third. So there's our major third, C to E. If I were to raise the lower pitch by a half step from C to C sharp, major third, there's a minor third. And if you were to count the half steps, it'll equal the 3 half steps that we have for a minor third. I also wanted to show a couple of examples of the intervals that have kind of inharmonic spellings and that affects their function. I'm going to start with this major third. So if I take C to E and I turn this into an augmented third by raising the E a half step to E sharp. Alright, so that's our augmented third. I'm now going to play a perfect fourth above C. That sounds the exact same as the augmented third. And if you recall in the first part of the video, I talked about augmented third not being written very often. Well, partially because it sounds like a perfect fourth. And the perfect fourth has a little more function once you start getting into your harmonies and such. I'm going to show you another example since, as I told you in the video, the first part of the video, I really enjoy the sound of the augmented six. So if I were to play C to G, making a perfect fifth, alright, and then I turn this into an augmented fifth by raising the G a half step to G sharp. Listen to that sound. Now, let's take a major sixth, C to A. And if I were to compress this, it becomes a minor six. And I'm going to create that minor six by changing A to A flat. And we play the perfect fifth again. Turn that perfect fifth to an augmented fifth. Now I'm going to play the augmented sixth. Or not augmented sixth, excuse me. The minor sixth. It sounds the exact same as an augmented fifth. And so you will see a little bit more function out of that minor sixth. The augmented fifth isn't necessarily wrong, but understand that those are intervals that sometimes are going to be a little bit more rare because they're inharmonics of more commonly used intervals. So we covered a lot in this video with perfect, major, augmented, diminished, and minor intervals. The thing to remember is it takes time to learn these things and become familiar with the concepts. So don't feel discouraged if you're having to practice some of these over and over again to get the idea of you take that perfect interval and you can expand it to be augmented or compress it to be diminished, or you take that major interval, expand it also to be augmented, or compress it to make it be minor. Hopefully you found the video useful for you. If you did, make sure that you click like on the video and also share with your fellow music students if you think that this video would be beneficial for them as well. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can be aware of when new content is posted. And thank you for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you the next time.